The first time I realized the neighborhood wasn't as peaceful as it seemed, I saw smoke curling from my father's old boat, years of memories gone in an instant. Flames consumed every plank while the HOA looked on, their rules and warnings meaningless in the face of this destruction. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and I knew this wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to intimidate me, to send a message that I didn't belong. But how far would I go when pushed too far, and could one person really stand up to an entire neighborhood of control and fear? Life on Cedar Creek Lane had always been deceptively calm. Mornings began with the soft rustle of leaves and the faint smell of dew on freshly cut grass. Alex, 35, a practical and quiet man with short brown hair, spent his weekends tending to the small garden beside his waterfront home, occasionally glancing at his father's old wooden boat tied to the dock, a vessel of countless memories from sunlit afternoons and long, peaceful fishing trips. The house wasn't large, but it was comfortable, a place where the hum of the nearby lake mixed with laughter and the occasional conversation from passing neighbors. The community itself looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, clean sidewalks, and uniform houses painted in shades of beige and gray created the impression of order. Neighbors waved politely when paths crossed, their smiles friendly yet slightly guarded. Alex had never minded the subtle distance. Everyone had their routines. But over time, small details began to shift. A lingering glance at his boat when he returned from work. A whispered comment about property value whenever he mentioned repainting the deck. A subtle tension beneath the smiles at the annual neighborhood picnic. The HOA seemed harmless at first. Their newsletters, reminders about lawn heights, and requests for uniform mailbox colors felt like mere suggestions. But one morning, a neatly folded letter appeared under Alex's door. A violation notice. Minor, almost laughable, but it carried a tone that made his stomach tighten. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the underlying message: we are watching, and you will comply. Despite these subtle warnings, Alex tried to carry on with his simple, peaceful life. He cleaned the dock, polished the boat, and tended the flowers. Yet a creeping unease settled in his chest. There was a quiet storm building beneath the community's polished surface, a tension that would soon erupt, testing not only his patience, but his very sense of belonging. Little did he know, that first letter was just the beginning of a relentless struggle that would escalate far beyond rules about paint colors and perfectly trimmed hedges. After that first ominous letter, the small, controlled world Alex had carefully maintained began to unravel. What had once been peaceful mornings by the waterfront transformed into days filled with anxiety and cautious observation. Every small action seemed to invite scrutiny. He painted the railing on his dock, only to receive a note a few days later about the wrong shade of brown, a color he had meticulously matched to the previous tone. A single weed left in the corner of his garden became a violation. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, often unsigned but stamped with the HOA's seal, each more threatening than the last. The fines weren't particularly large, but it wasn't about the money. It was about control, about sending a message that Alex didn't belong, that he could be dominated through petty regulations and relentless monitoring. Neighbors who had once been polite and distant now became part of the oppressive atmosphere. Some whispered behind his back, eyes flicking to the dock and the boat as if it were a crime scene. A few brave souls tried to offer support, hinting that the HOA had a reputation for overreach, but most preferred to stay quiet, fearful that any alignment with Alex could make them targets as well. Even the casual community gatherings, which had once felt safe, now felt like stages for silent judgment. Every smile seemed forced. Every nod held a trace of calculation. The harassment escalated. Alex began finding cryptic messages scrawled on the dock, subtle marks near the boat, small warnings that spoke of someone watching. One evening, as he returned from work, he discovered footprints across the freshly painted railing, muddy impressions that led straight to the boat. There was no physical damage, no theft, but the intimidation was unmistakable. Whoever had done this wanted him unsettled, wanted him questioning his own right to enjoy the property his father had cherished. Attempts to reason with the HOA proved futile. Alex attended meetings, voice calm but firm, pointing out inconsistencies in their bylaws. providing photographic evidence of the boat and garden in compliance. But the board dismissed every argument, twisting the rules to maintain power. Emails went unanswered, phone calls redirected, and every attempt at documentation seemed to vanish into a bureaucratic black hole. They had perfected a system of harassment that was legally gray, morally dubious, and psychologically exhausting. Fines multiplied. At first, it was a single $50 charge for a minor lawn infraction. Soon, there were daily notices for supposed violations of obscure clauses. Alex's mailbox overflowed with warnings about aesthetic violations, unauthorized dock alterations, and community guideline infractions he had never even heard of. Each envelope carried the same tone of quiet menace, compliance or consequences. The letters were precise, almost clinical, but their intent was terrifyingly human, an orchestrated attempt to break him down. Alex began keeping meticulous records. Each letter, each inspection, each subtle threat was cataloged. Photos were taken, dates logged, and every conversation noted in a growing binder that became both shield and weapon. Late nights were spent poring over HOA regulations, cross-referencing city codes, and searching for weaknesses in their system. The sense of helplessness that had crept over him in the early days was replaced with a determination as sharp as a blade. If they wanted a battle, they would have one, but on his terms. Then came the first direct act of aggression. One morning, Alex walked down to the dock and froze. The boat, his father's old wooden vessel, was surrounded by strange symbols, spray-painted warnings that seemed designed more to intimidate than to convey any logical message. The acrid smell of paint stung his nostrils, and he could feel his pulse quicken. He wasn't just facing petty fines anymore. This was personal. Someone was trying to scare him into submission, and the audacity of the act left no doubt. The HOA, or someone with their tacit support, would stop at nothing. Every interaction now carried tension. Meetings with the board became verbal sparring matches, each question and answer loaded with potential consequences. A single misstep, a raised voice, a pointed gesture, anything could be twisted into another violation. Even casual glances from neighbors felt weighted, like silent tests of loyalty. The community that had once offered a sense of belonging now felt like a maze of traps, each corner hiding a new threat. Despite the pressure, Alex's determination grew. He began plotting, using every tool at his disposal. Legal research became a nightly ritual, and strategies were carefully mapped out. He learned to anticipate the board's moves, predicting the next likely violation or warning. Slowly, methodically, he transformed his anxiety into a weapon. Every unfair rule, every petty fine, every invasive inspection became a piece in a larger puzzle he was assembling, an eventual counterstrike that would expose the HOA's abuse of power. But tension escalated further when a routine neighborhood walk turned into a confrontation. Alex noticed the board members hovering near the communal gate, whispering and pointing. Their eyes locked on him, sharp and calculating. One board member, a woman in her early 50s with tightly styled blonde hair, raised a finger as if marking him for future punishment. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the simmering anger, and the unmistakable thrill of challenge. The stakes were higher than ever, and the neighborhood's gaze added weight to every move. Then one evening, the culmination of months of harassment hit. Alex returned from a long day to see smoke rising faintly from the dock. His heart sank as the acrid smell reached him, the unmistakable scent of burning wood. Flames licked the edges of his father's boat. Panic surged, but alongside it, a sharp clarity emerged. This was no longer about petty fines or obscure rules. This was about power, intimidation, and defiance. Someone had crossed a line, and Alex realized he had no choice but to strike back decisively. The tension had reached a boiling point. Alex had spent months meticulously documenting every slight, every petty fine, every intimidation tactic the HOA had deployed, every cryptic note, every graffiti mark, every subtle act of harassment had been logged, photographed, and cross-referenced with state laws and city ordinances. Now, as he prepared for the confrontation he had been planning in the shadows, the quiet anxiety that had gripped him for weeks transformed into a sharp, focused determination. The board had pushed too far, and the moment for reckoning had arrived. It began with a subtle maneuver. Alex initiated a series of legal steps that no HOA board member had anticipated. Letters of violation and fines were suddenly countered by formal legal notices, freezing their accounts and halting any pending actions against him. The familiar smugness that the board had worn like armor faltered. They had underestimated him. Word of the legal bombshell spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once watched silently from behind curtains now gathered in quiet fascination, murmuring as they glimpsed the board's growing frustration. Alex stood at the center of the storm, adrenaline and vindication coursing through him. Every threat the board had issued, every fine they had imposed, every subtle intimidation tactic had prepared him for this moment. The climax came at an emergency HOA meeting. Alex faced the board, their faces tight with anger and disbelief. Calmly, he presented evidence: violations, fines, intimidation tactics, and mismanagement. Screens displayed frozen accounts, misused funds, and email trails revealing harassment. The board members' authority crumbled in real time. Neighbors watched as smugness gave way to panic. The room shifted. The once powerful board was exposed, powerless, humiliated. Alex's voice remained steady, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily in the room. He described how every attempt to intimidate him, graffiti, threats, fines, surveillance, had been cataloged and turned into evidence. The final blow came when he detailed the frozen accounts. The financial leverage the HOA had relied upon was now in his control, effectively halting their operations. Even as the tension slowly ebbed, one flicker of uncertainty lingered. What would be the long-term consequences of exposing this conflict so publicly? Standing outside the HOA building, the evening sunlight casting long shadows across the parking lot, Alex exhaled deeply. The peak of the battle had passed, but the story was far from over. The aftermath left the community buzzing. The boat was finally secure, the dock freshly painted. Neighbors began approaching Alex with nods and quiet words of encouragement. The HOA board had crumbled. Some resigned, others remained under scrutiny and limited authority. The neighborhood slowly transformed with open meetings, clear rules, and increased transparency. Alex's resilience had catalyzed structural change. For Alex, the victory was deeply personal. He had reclaimed not just his father's legacy, but a sense of agency, security, and self-respect. The ordeal had tested him, but it had also proven that determination, preparation, and courage could challenge even entrenched systems. Daily routines, watering the garden, walking along the dock, watching the lake, felt restorative once more. His story became a lesson for the entire neighborhood. Meetings now ran openly with fair guidelines, board members subdued yet cooperative, and Alex advising calmly. The atmosphere had shifted from fear to cautious collaboration. The community had learned that transparency, preparation, and resilience could check power. Life continued, but with a renewed sense of accountability and shared respect. Finally, the neighborhood itself settled into a new rhythm. Streets were alive with families chatting, children playing, and neighbors walking by the lake. Alex strolled along the dock, his father's restored boat floating peacefully beside him. Golden sunlight reflected off the water, illuminating the unity and balance now restored to Cedar Creek Lane. Peace, hard-won and deeply felt, had returned.